Okinawa, 1945. A mother sits motionless, holding her dead child. In his tiny hand, a note. "Forgive me." The American soldier who found her spoke Japanese. What he discovered would haunt him for 50 years. June 18, 1945. 3 days before Okinawa would be declared secure. The heat was suffocating, the kind that makes your uniform stick to your skin and your thoughts move slowly through thick air. Sergeant Kenji Tanaka stood at the edge of a civilian refugee processing area in southern Okinawa, watching hundreds of displaced people emerge from caves and destroyed villages. Most were women, children, and elderly men. The able-bodied men were either dead or still fighting in the hills. Kenji had been doing this work for weeks now. Approach slowly, speak gentle Japanese, convince them the Americans won't torture them, won't rape the women, won't bayonet the children. Convince them that everything their own military told them was a lie. Some believed him. Many didn't. Some had already killed themselves and their families rather than face capture. He was 24 years old and felt ancient. That's when he saw her. Sitting apart from the other civilians, unnaturally still in a landscape of constant motion. Everyone else was crying, talking, searching for family members, accepting water and rations from medics. She simply sat, her back against a destroyed wall, holding something in her arms. As Kenji walked closer, his stomach tightened. He knew what he was seeing before his mind wanted to accept it. The child in her arms wasn't sleeping. The boy's skin had the waxy quality of death, his small body rigid in a way that suggested he'd been gone for at least 2 days. The woman's eyes were open but vacant, staring at nothing, seeing everything. Kenji stopped 3 feet away. He'd been trained for this, sort of. The Military Intelligence Service Language School had taught him how to interrogate prisoners, how to translate captured documents, how to use language as a weapon. They hadn't taught him what to do when language failed completely, when the only honest response to what you were witnessing was silence. But he had a job to do. "Onamae wa nan desu ka?" he asked softly. "What is your name?" The woman didn't respond, didn't even blink. Kenji crouched down, making himself smaller, less threatening. He noticed details now. Her clothing was torn and covered in limestone dust from cave walls. Her hands, still wrapped around the child, were cut and bleeding, fingernails broken. She'd been digging, trying to save someone. "I'm Sergeant Tanaka," he said, still in Japanese. "I'm here to help you." The word help seemed to break through. Her eyes focused on him for the first time, and what he saw there made him want to look away. It wasn't grief exactly, though grief was certainly present. It was something deeper. Guilt. The kind that eats you from the inside. "You speak our language," she said. Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Yes. I was born in California, but my parents came from Hiroshima Prefecture. I grew up speaking Japanese at home." She looked at him more carefully now, taking in his American uniform, his Japanese face. "You fight for them." It wasn't a question, but Kenji answered anyway. "Yes. Against your own people. Against the Japanese military, not against people like you." She laughed, a sound without humor. "There is no difference anymore. We are all soldiers now, even the children." She looked down at the boy in her arms. "Especially the children." Kenji saw it then. A small piece of paper clutched in the child's stiff fingers. The woman noticed his gaze and carefully, tenderly, removed the note. She held it out to him. The handwriting was shaky but deliberate. 2 words in hiragana. The simple script children learn first. "Yurushi nasai," forgive me. "He wrote this?" Kenji asked. "His last words. He was 4 years old and his last words were asking me to forgive myself." Her voice cracked. "How can I? How can anyone?" Kenji should have called for a medic, should have moved on to the next civilian, should have maintained professional distance. Instead, he sat down on the rubble-strewn ground beside her. "Tell me what happened," he said. To understand why Kenji Tanaka sat with that grieving mother, instead of following orders, you have to understand where he came from. You have to understand what it meant to be Nisei, second-generation Japanese American, in the years leading up to and during World War II. Kenji was born in Sacramento, California, in 1921. His father, Hiroshi, had immigrated from Japan in 1906, part of the wave of Japanese laborers who came to work on farms and railroads. His mother, Yuki, arrived in 1919 as a picture bride, married to Hiroshi through photographs exchanged across the Pacific before they ever met in person. By the time Kenji was born, his father had saved enough to lease 20 acres of farmland in the Sacramento Valley. They grew strawberries, tomatoes, and lettuce. It was back-breaking work, but Hiroshi was proud. He'd built something. He had land, a family, a future. Kenji grew up between two worlds. At home they spoke Japanese, ate Japanese food, observed Japanese customs. His mother insisted on this. "You must know where you come from," she would say. "You must honor your ancestors." But outside the home, Kenji was American. He attended public school with white, Mexican, and Chinese kids. He played baseball. He listened to jazz on the radio. He read Mark Twain and dreamed of going to college, maybe becoming a teacher or a journalist. His English was perfect, unaccented. Sometimes his parents had to ask him to translate American idioms they didn't understand. This dual identity felt natural to Kenji. He didn't see it as a contradiction. He was Japanese and American, both at once, and that seemed fine. California in the 1930s had large Japanese-American communities. In Sacramento, there were Japanese language schools, Buddhist temples, community organizations. The Nisei generation was carving out a space for themselves, proving they belonged. Kenji was accepted to the University of California, Berkeley, in 1939. His father was so proud he cried, though he tried to hide it. Kenji would be the first in their family to attend university. He planned to study English literature and education. He wanted to teach, to help other Nisei kids navigate between their two worlds. Then came December 7th, 1941. Kenji was in his dorm room studying for finals when someone ran down the hall shouting that Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor. At first he didn't believe it. It had to be a mistake, a rumor. But when he turned on the radio, there it was. President Roosevelt's voice, grave and certain, a date which will live in infamy. Kenji's first thought was for his parents. His second thought was more selfish. What does this mean for me? He found out quickly. Within hours, FBI agents were rounding up Japanese community leaders, Buddhist priests, Japanese language school teachers. Anyone with ties to Japan was suspect. Kenji's father wasn't arrested, but their bank accounts were frozen. Japanese-American newspapers were shut down. A curfew was imposed. All persons of Japanese ancestry had to be in their homes between 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. The campus turned hostile overnight. Students who'd been friendly suddenly avoided him. Someone spray-painted "Jap Go Home" on his dorm room door. A professor suggested he might want to withdraw from classes for his own safety. Kenji went home to Sacramento in January of 1942. His father's farm was still there, but everything felt different. Neighbors who'd bought their produce for years now looked at them with suspicion. Signs appeared in store windows. No Japs allowed. Then came February 19th, Executive Order 9066. All persons of Japanese ancestry, citizen or not, would be removed from the West Coast and relocated to internment camps. They had 2 weeks to sell or store everything they owned, to abandon the lives they'd built. Hiroshi tried to fight it. "We're American citizens," he insisted. "Kenji was born here. They can't do this." But they could, and they did. The Tanaka family was sent to Manzanar, a camp in the California desert. 10,000 people crammed into tar paper barracks surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Families lived in single rooms, 20 feet by 25 feet, with no privacy, no insulation against the desert heat or cold. They ate in mess halls, used communal bathrooms, stood in line for everything. Kenji watched his father shrink. Hiroshi had been a proud man, a landowner, someone who'd built something from nothing. Now he was prisoner number 18,412, living on government rations, with nothing to do but wait. The anger in the camps was palpable. How could America do this to its own citizens? How could they imprison children, elderly people, families who'd done nothing wrong? Some people organized protests. Others withdrew into depression. A few renounced their American citizenship entirely, requesting repatriation to Japan. Then came the loyalty questionnaire in 1943. Every adult in the camps had to answer 2 questions. Question 27. Are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered? Question 28. Will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States and forswear any form of allegiance to the Japanese emperor? These questions tore families apart. If you answered yes to both, you were affirming loyalty to a country that had imprisoned you. If you answered no, you were labeled disloyal, potentially sent to a higher security camp, possibly even prosecuted. Hiroshi answered no. He was done with America. They put us in prison, he said. They took everything. And now they want us to fight for them? No, I will not. Kenji understood his father's anger. He felt it too, but he also felt something else. A need to prove something, to show that Japanese Americans were loyal, that they belonged, that they weren't the enemy. When the army announced it was forming an all-Nisei combat unit, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, Kenji volunteered. His father was furious. You're a traitor, Hiroshi said. You're helping them destroy Japan. I'm helping prove we're American, Kenji replied. By killing Japanese people? Kenji didn't have an answer for that. But he also didn't have an answer for what he would do if he stayed in Manzanar. Watching his father's spirit die a little more each day. Watching his mother cry silently in the corner of their cramped barrack. The army didn't send Kenji to the 442nd. His Japanese language skills were too valuable. Instead, he was assigned to the Military Intelligence Service, the MIS. He was sent to Camp Savage in Minnesota for training as an interpreter and translator. The training was intense. Kenji's Japanese was good, but it was conversational, family-level Japanese. He had to learn military terminology, formal speech patterns, regional dialects. He had to learn to read captured documents quickly, to interrogate prisoners effectively, to translate under pressure. He also had to learn to separate himself emotionally from what he was doing. The instructors were clear about this. You will see Japanese faces, they said. You will hear your mother's dialect. You cannot let that affect your work. You are American soldiers first. Kenji tried. He really did. But when he shipped out to the Pacific in 1944, when he started interrogating Japanese prisoners of war, translating their letters home, listening to their fears and hopes and humanity, the separation became harder and harder to maintain. The Japanese POWs saw him as a traitor, an Inu, a dog. They spat at him, refused to speak to him, called him worse than an American because he'd betrayed his own blood. The American soldiers didn't fully trust him either. They'd work with him because they had to, but there was always distance. Always the unspoken question, whose side are you really on? Kenji belonged nowhere. He was too Japanese for the Americans, too American for the Japanese. He existed in a liminal space, translating between two worlds, but fully accepted by neither. By the time he arrived in Okinawa in April of 1945, he'd learned to numb himself. Do the job. Don't think too much. Don't feel too much. Translate the words, not the humanity behind them. That strategy worked until he met Fumiko. To understand what Fumiko experienced, what drove her to make the choice she made, you need to understand the Battle of Okinawa. It was the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War, and civilians paid the highest price. The American invasion began on April 1st, 1945. Operation Iceberg. The plan was to capture Okinawa as a staging ground for the eventual invasion of mainland Japan. The island was only 350 miles from Japan's home islands. Taking it would give the Americans air bases for bombing runs and a launching point for the final assault. The Japanese knew this. They also knew they couldn't win. But they could make the Americans pay such a high price that maybe, just maybe, The United States would negotiate a peace rather than invade Japan itself. So the Japanese military dug in. They built elaborate cave systems and underground fortifications. They positioned artillery in the hills, and they prepared for a battle of attrition, a fight to the death. The Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, had over 100,000 troops. But he also had something else, the Okinawan civilian population. About 300,000 civilians lived on the island. The Japanese military conscripted thousands of them, forcing men and boys to fight, women and girls to serve as nurses and laborers. But even those not formally conscripted were caught in the battle. The Japanese military told civilians that the Americans were demons who would rape, torture, and murder them. They distributed grenades to families, instructing them to kill themselves rather than be captured. They forced civilians into caves that became death traps when American forces used flamethrowers and explosives to clear them. The battle lasted 82 days. By the time it ended in late June, 12,000 Americans were dead and 38,000 wounded. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers were killed, and somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilians died. 150,000. Let that number sink in. That's roughly 1/4 of Okinawa's entire population. Men, women, children, elderly, dead from artillery, aerial bombardment, starvation, disease, and forced mass suicide. The term used in Japanese is kyosei shudan-shi, forced mass suicide. Japanese soldiers would gather civilians in caves and order them to kill themselves with grenades. Families would huddle together, pull the pin, and die in each other's arms. Mothers would kill their children first, then themselves. Those who refused were sometimes killed by Japanese soldiers for being traitors. This wasn't an accident or a side effect of war. It was policy. The Japanese military believed that civilians who surrendered would give intelligence to the Americans. They also believed that mass civilian deaths would demonstrate Japanese resolve and make the Americans think twice about invading the home islands. The Americans tried to counter this. They dropped leaflets in Japanese, promising safety for those who surrendered. They used loudspeakers, broadcasting messages in Japanese, begging civilians to come out of the caves. They sent Nisei interpreters like Kenji to the front lines to communicate with civilians, to convince them that surrender didn't mean death. Sometimes it worked. Thousands of civilians did surrender and were processed through refugee camps. They were given food, medical care, and eventually resettled in safer areas of the island. But sometimes it didn't work. Sometimes families chose death together rather than face the unknown. Sometimes civilians were so traumatized, so convinced of American brutality, that they couldn't be reached. And sometimes the choice was taken away from them entirely. Fumiko began talking slowly, her voice flat, as if she were describing something that happened to someone else. Kenji listened, translating her words in his mind, though there was no one else there to translate for. He was simply bearing witness. Her full name was Fumiko Nakamura. She was 32 years old, from a small farming village in central Okinawa. Her husband, Takeshi, had been conscripted into the Japanese Imperial Army in 1944. She hadn't heard from him in over a year and assumed he was dead. She had 2 children. Akiko, her daughter, was 7 years old. Kenji, her son, was 4. Yes, his name was Kenji too. The American sergeant felt something twist in his chest when she said it. When the Americans invaded in April, Fumiko's village was in the path of the advancing forces. Japanese soldiers came through, ordering all civilians to evacuate south. They were told to bring only what they could carry. Everything else would be left behind. Fumiko packed rice, water, blankets, and her children. They joined a stream of refugees, thousands of people fleeing on foot, carrying elderly relatives, dragging carts, herding livestock. American planes flew overhead constantly. Sometimes they dropped leaflets. Sometimes they dropped bombs. The Japanese soldiers directed them to a series of caves in the hills. "You'll be safe here," they said. "The Americans won't find you here. Wait until we drive them back into the sea." Fumiko knew this was a lie. Everyone knew. But what choice did they have? The Americans were coming from the north. The Japanese were retreating south. The civilians were caught in between, with nowhere to go but underground. The cave system was massive, carved into limestone cliffs over centuries by water and time. Hundreds of families crowded inside, claiming small spaces in the darkness. There was no sanitation, little food, and the air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and fear. Fumiko found a spot near one of the cave entrances, reasoning that fresh air was worth the increased danger of discovery. She spread out their blanket and tried to make the children comfortable. Akiko, her daughter, understood enough to be quiet. Little Kenji kept asking when they could go home, when Papa would come back, why they had to hide in the dark. Soon, Fumiko told him. We'll go home soon. Days passed, maybe a week. Time became meaningless in the cave. The sounds of battle grew closer. Artillery shells shook the ground. The concussive force of explosions made dust rain down from the cave ceiling. Children cried. Old people prayed. Young men, barely teenagers, clutched bamboo spears and talked about dying honorably. Then the Japanese soldiers came back, but they weren't retreating to regroup. They were retreating to die, and they wanted to take the civilians with them. An officer gathered everyone near the main chamber. He gave a speech about honor, about the emperor, about the necessity of choosing death over the shame of capture. He said the Americans would do unspeakable things to them. He said it was better to die as Japanese than live as American prisoners. Then he started distributing grenades. Some families took them. Fumiko watched a grandmother accept 2 grenades, one for herself and her grandchildren, another for her daughter and infant. The woman's face was calm, resigned. She'd already decided. When the officer approached Fumiko, she refused. "I have children," she said. "I won't kill my children." The officer's face hardened. "Then you're a traitor. When the Americans come, your children will suffer because of your cowardice." He moved on. But Fumiko saw the looks from other civilians. Judgment. Contempt. She was breaking the unspoken agreement, the collective decision to die together rather than face the enemy. That night she heard the first grenade explode, then another, then screaming, crying, the sounds of families dying in the darkness. Fumiko covered her children's ears, held them close, whispered that everything would be okay even though she knew it wouldn't. By morning, dozens were dead. The cave smelled of blood and explosives. The survivors, those who'd refused or hadn't yet worked up the courage, sat in stunned silence among the bodies. Then the Americans arrived. Fumiko heard English voices, harsh and foreign. She heard the metallic sounds of weapons. She heard a loudspeaker, someone speaking Japanese with an American accent, telling them to come out, promising safety, food, medical care. Some people believed it. They started moving toward the entrance, hands raised, calling out that they were civilians, unarmed. Then the shooting started. Fumiko never knew who fired first. Maybe a Japanese soldier still hiding in the cave. Maybe a nervous American at the entrance. It didn't matter. Suddenly there was chaos. Gunfire echoing off stone walls. People screaming, running deeper into the cave. Children separated from parents in the darkness. Fumiko grabbed both her children's hands and ran, away from the entrance, away from the shooting, deeper into the cave system. They ran until they found a small side chamber, barely big enough for the 3 of them. They huddled there in absolute darkness, listening to the sounds of battle, of death, of the world ending. Then the cave started to collapse. Not all at once. But the American forces were using explosives to seal cave entrances, to force out any Japanese soldiers still hiding inside. The concussive force of the explosions caused sections of the cave to collapse. Fumiko heard the rumbling, felt the ground shake, heard the screams of people trapped under falling rock. Then their chamber started to collapse. Fumiko saw the entrance to their small space beginning to crumble, rocks falling, the opening getting smaller. She had maybe seconds to act. She could see both her children in the dim light filtering through the collapsing entrance. Akiko, 7 years old, tall for her age. Kenji, 4 years old, small and frightened. The opening was getting smaller. She could maybe get one child through. Maybe. She grabbed Akiko's hand and pulled. The girl was closer, easier to reach. Fumiko dragged her daughter through the collapsing entrance just as a large boulder crashed down, sealing the chamber. Sealing little Kenji inside. Fumiko screamed. She clawed at the rocks with her bare hands, trying to move the boulder, trying to dig through. Akiko was crying, pulling at her mother's arm, begging her to stop, saying they had to run. The whole cave was collapsing. But Fumiko couldn't leave him. She kept digging, kept screaming his name even as other rocks fell around them, even as dust filled her lungs. Then she heard it, faint, from behind the rocks. Her son's voice. "Mama, Mama, it's dark. I'm scared." "I'm here, baby, I'm here. Mama's going to get you out." She dug harder. Her fingernails broke, her hands bled, she didn't care. "Mama, why did you take Akiko first?" The question stopped her cold. I was closer to her. I could reach her. But I'm smaller. I could have fit through faster." He was right. God help her, he was right. She'd made a choice in a split second and she'd chosen wrong. Or maybe there was no right choice. Maybe both choices were wrong. Maybe that's what war does. It makes every choice wrong. "I'm sorry, baby. I'm so sorry. Mama made a mistake." "It's okay, Mama." His voice was getting weaker. "It's hard to breathe." "No, no, no. Stay with me. Keep talking to me." She dug faster. Other survivors were fleeing past her now, heading toward another exit, but she couldn't leave. She couldn't abandon him. It took her 2 hours to move enough rocks to create a small opening. By then, the sounds of battle had moved away. The cave was quiet except for her own ragged breathing and Akiko's soft crying. Fumiko squeezed through the opening. The chamber was dark, filled with dust. She found her son by touch, pulled him into her arms. He was still alive. Barely. A large rock had fallen on his legs. He was trapped, crushed. Even in the darkness, she could feel the wrongness of his body, the way his legs bent at angles that legs shouldn't bend. "Mama," he whispered. "It hurts." "I know, baby. I know. Mama's here now." She tried to move the rock. It wouldn't budge. She tried to pull him free. He screamed in pain. She stopped. She held him instead, held him in the darkness while he died. It took 3 hours. 3 hours of him asking why she didn't save him first, why she chose Akiko, whether she loved his sister more. 3 hours of her telling him she loved him, she was sorry, she'd made a terrible mistake. Please forgive her. Near the end, when his breathing was shallow and his voice was barely a whisper, he asked for paper and a pencil. Fumiko had a small notebook in her pocket, something she'd grabbed when they fled their village. She had a pencil stub. In the darkness, by touch, little Kenji wrote 2 words. His hand was shaking. The characters were barely legible. But he wrote them. "Yurushinasai. Forgive me." "Why are you asking me to forgive you?" Fumiko sobbed. "You didn't do anything wrong. I'm the one who needs forgiveness. You were scared, Mama. You made a mistake. It's okay. I forgive you. Now you have to forgive yourself." Those were his last words. He died in her arms in that collapsed cave chamber, holding a note asking his mother to forgive herself for a choice no mother should ever have to make. Fumiko didn't know how long she sat there, holding his body. Eventually, Akiko came back, having hidden in another part of the cave. Together they carried little Kenji's body out into the daylight. The battle had moved on. The area was now controlled by American forces. Fumiko walked through the destroyed landscape, carrying her dead son, her surviving daughter walking silently beside her, until she found a wall to sit against. And there she stayed, for 2 days, unable to let go, unable to move forward, unable to forgive herself, until an American soldier with a Japanese face sat down beside her and asked her name. Kenji Tanaka sat with Fumiko for over an hour, violating every protocol, ignoring the calls from his commanding officer to move on to the next civilian. He listened to her story in Japanese, witnessed her pain in a language his mother spoke, and felt the weight of translation in a way he never had before. Translation isn't just converting words from one language to another. It's carrying meaning across cultures, across experiences, across the unbridgeable gap between one human soul and another. And sometimes, Kenji realized, Some things can't be translated. Some pain is too specific, too personal, too enormous to fit into any language. But he tried anyway. When the medical officer finally came over, annoyed at the delay, demanding to know what was taking so long, Kenji had to translate Fumiko's story into English, had to reduce 3 hours of anguished confession into a brief report. "She's in severe psychological shock," Kenji said. "She was trapped in a cave collapse during the battle. Her son was killed. She's been sitting here for 2 days. She needs immediate psychiatric care." The medical officer looked at the woman, at the dead child, at the note still clutched in small fingers. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "All right, we'll get her to the field hospital. You need to move on, Sergeant. We've got 200 more civilians to process." "Yes, sir." But Kenji didn't move. Not yet. He turned back to Fumiko. "They're going to take care of you," he said in Japanese. "They'll take you to a hospital. They'll help you." "No one can help me," Fumiko replied. "I killed my son." "No, the war killed your son. You tried to save him." "I chose wrong." "There was no right choice. You had seconds to decide. You saved your daughter. That's not wrong. Then why does it feel like I murdered him?" Kenji didn't have an answer. How could he? He'd never had children. He'd never faced that kind of choice. But he thought about his own mother back in Manzanar, and he thought about what she would feel if she had to choose between him and his younger brother. "My mother once told me," Kenji said slowly, "that being a parent means carrying impossible weight. You carry your children's pain, their fears, their futures, and sometimes you have to make choices that will hurt you for the rest of your life, but you make them anyway because you're trying to protect them. You didn't kill your son. You tried to save both your children in an impossible situation. The fact that you couldn't save both doesn't make you a murderer. It makes you human." Fumiko looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. "You speak like a Japanese man, but you wear an American uniform. Which are you?" "Both, neither, I don't know anymore." "Does it hurt, being split between two worlds?" "Every day." She nodded slowly. "Then maybe you do understand." The medics came then, gently taking little Kenji's body from his mother's arms. Fumiko didn't resist, but she kept the note, clutched it to her chest like a talisman. As they led her away, she turned back to Kenji. "What's your name? Your real name, not your American rank." Kenji Tanaka. "The same name as my son." "Yes. Maybe that's why you found me. Maybe he sent you." Kenji didn't believe in ghosts or fate or divine intervention, but in that moment, he wanted to. He wanted to believe that there was some meaning to this encounter, some reason why he'd been the one to find her, to hear her story, to witness her impossible grief. "Maybe," he said. That night, back in his tent, Kenji couldn't sleep. He kept seeing Fumiko's face, hearing her story, imagining the choice she'd had to make. He kept thinking about the note, 2 words, written by a dying 4-year-old boy, asking his mother to forgive herself. Could she? Could anyone forgive themselves for something like that? Could he forgive himself for what he was doing? For translating interrogations of Japanese soldiers who saw him as a traitor? For helping the American military destroy the land of his ancestors? For leaving his family in an internment camp while he fought for the country that imprisoned them? Kenji realized that he and Fumiko weren't so different. They'd both made impossible choices. They were both caught between worlds, between loyalties, between the person they wanted to be and the person circumstances forced them to become. And they both carried notes they couldn't read without pain. Hers was written on paper. His was written on his soul. Fumiko's story wasn't unique. Over the following days and weeks, as Kenji continued processing civilians, he heard variations of it again and again. The details changed, but the core remained the same. Impossible choices, unbearable guilt, grief too large for any language to contain. He met a grandmother who had killed her 3 grandchildren with a grenade because a Japanese soldier told her the Americans would torture them. She survived the blast. They didn't. She kept asking Kenji if the soldier had been telling the truth. Would the Americans have tortured them? Kenji said no, but he could see she didn't believe him. She needed the soldier to have been telling the truth, because if he was lying, then she'd murdered her grandchildren for nothing. He met a teenage girl who'd watched her mother jump off a cliff with her baby brother rather than surrender. The girl had refused to jump. Now she was alive, and her family was dead, and she couldn't decide if she was brave or a coward. He met a man who'd been forced by Japanese soldiers to kill his own brother for trying to surrender to the Americans. The soldiers said the brother was a traitor. They made the man do it, held a gun to his head, said they'd kill his whole family if he refused. So he did it. He killed his brother with his own hands, and now he had to live with that. These stories accumulated in Kenji's mind like sediment, layer upon layer of trauma, until he felt like he was drowning in other people's pain. The other interpreters felt it too. They'd gather in the evenings exhausted, and sometimes they'd talk about what they'd heard. Sometimes they'd just sit in silence, because there was nothing to say. One interpreter, a Nisei named Tom Sakamoto from Los Angeles, told Kenji about a woman he'd processed who'd smothered her own infant to keep it from crying and revealing their hiding place to American soldiers. The baby died. The soldiers never came. She'd killed her child for nothing. How do you translate that? Tom asked. How do you put that in a report? Subject admits to infanticide under duress? That doesn't capture it. That doesn't come close. I don't think language can capture it, Kenji replied. I think some things are beyond words. Then what are we doing here? We're supposed to be bridges, right? Translating between two sides, helping them understand each other. But how can Americans understand this? How can anyone who wasn't here, who didn't see it, possibly understand? Kenji didn't have an answer. The truth was, the American soldiers didn't want to understand. They couldn't afford to. Understanding meant empathy, and empathy meant recognizing the humanity of the enemy, and recognizing the enemy's humanity made it harder to kill them. So most American soldiers maintained a careful distance. The Japanese were Japs, subhuman, fanatical, incomprehensible. It was easier that way. But Kenji couldn't maintain that distance. Every Japanese face he saw reminded him of his parents, his relatives, his community. Every story he translated reminded him that these were people, not monsters. They were farmers and teachers and mothers and children, caught in a war they didn't start and couldn't stop. And yet, he also knew what Japanese soldiers had done. He'd translated captured documents describing atrocities. He'd interrogated prisoners who admitted to war crimes. He'd seen the results of Japanese military brutality against Chinese civilians, against Allied prisoners, against their own Okinawan population. There were no clean hands in this war, no pure victims or pure villains, just humans making terrible choices in terrible circumstances, and then having to live with the consequences, or not live with them. Kenji heard that the grandmother who'd killed her grandchildren had hanged herself in the civilian hospital 3 days after he'd processed her. The teenage girl whose mother had jumped off the cliff tried to do the same, but was stopped by nurses. The man who'd killed his brother disappeared one night and was never found. Fumiko survived, physically at least. Kenji checked on her once, a week after their encounter. She was in a civilian hospital tent, staring at nothing, the note still clutched in her hand. The doctors said she wasn't eating, wasn't speaking. She was alive, but barely. Kenji sat beside her bed. Fumiko-san, he said softly. It's Kenji, the interpreter. Do you remember me? She turned her head slowly. Recognition flickered in her eyes. The American with my son's name. Yes, I wanted to see how you were doing. I'm alive. My son isn't. That's how I'm doing. Your daughter needs you. My daughter would be better off without me. I'm the mother who let her brother die. You're the mother who saved her life by sacrificing her brother. Kenji wanted to argue, to convince her that she'd done nothing wrong, that she was a victim of circumstances beyond her control. But he realized that would be a lie. Not because she was guilty, but because guilt and innocence were inadequate categories for what she'd experienced. She'd made a choice. The choice had consequences. She would carry those consequences for the rest of her life. No amount of absolution from him or anyone else would change that. "Your son forgave you," Kenji said finally. He wrote it down. "He wanted you to forgive yourself." He was 4 years old. He didn't understand what he was forgiving. Maybe, or maybe he understood better than any of us. Children see things simply sometimes. He loved you. He didn't want you to suffer. That's what the note means. Fumiko closed her eyes. A single tear ran down her cheek. "I will carry this until I die. I know. Will you remember him? Will you remember my son?" "Yes, I promise." It was the only thing he could offer her: witness, memory, the promise that her son's death and her impossible choice wouldn't be forgotten. On August 15th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast. The war was over. Kenji heard the news in a tent on Okinawa, surrounded by other soldiers who cheered and cried and hugged each other. They'd survived. They were going home. The nightmare was ending. Kenji felt relief, certainly, but also something more complicated: grief for all the lives lost, guilt for being alive when so many weren't, and a strange emptiness, as if the war had hollowed him out and he didn't know how to fill the space it left behind. The other Nisei interpreters felt it too. They'd spent years translating between two worlds, and now that the war was over, they didn't know which world they belonged to. Were they American soldiers who'd served their country? Or were they Japanese Americans who'd helped destroy Japan? "My father won't speak to me," Tom Sakamoto said. "I wrote him from Okinawa, told him the war was over, told him I'd be coming home soon. He wrote back one sentence: 'You are no son of mine.'" Kenji hadn't heard from his father at all. His mother wrote occasionally. Brief letters that said everything was fine, they were managing, she was proud of him. But Kenji could read between the lines. His father was angry. His father felt betrayed. And Kenji would have to face that when he went home. The journey back to the United States took weeks. By the time Kenji arrived in California in October of 1945, the internment camps were closing. The government had decided, now that the war was over, that Japanese Americans were no longer a threat. How generous. Manzanar was nearly empty when Kenji arrived. Most families had already left, trying to rebuild their lives, returning to communities that didn't want them, to homes that had been vandalized or sold, to jobs that no longer existed. The Tanaka family was still there, waiting for Kenji. His mother saw him first. She ran to him, crying, holding him like she'd never let go. His younger brother Taro, who'd been 15 when they were imprisoned and was now 18, shook his hand awkwardly, not sure how to relate to this older brother who'd become a soldier. His father stood apart, arms crossed, face unreadable. "Oto-san," Kenji said. "Father." Hiroshi looked at his son's uniform, at the sergeant's stripes, at the military intelligence service insignia. "You helped them," he said. "You helped them destroy our people. I helped end the war. I helped save lives. By taking Japanese lives. By translating. By convincing civilians to surrender instead of killing themselves. By being a bridge. A bridge that only goes one way, toward America. Away from Japan. I am American, Father. So are you. So is our whole family. America put us in prison. And I fought to prove we belong here anyway." Hiroshi shook his head. "You proved nothing. You just showed them we'll do anything for their approval, even betray our own blood." The words hit Kenji like a physical blow. He'd known his father was angry, but hearing it spoken aloud, hearing himself called a traitor by his own father, was worse than he'd imagined. "I'm not a traitor," Kenji said quietly. "I'm a man who made impossible choices in an impossible situation, just like you, just like everyone. Don't compare your choices to mine. I chose loyalty. You chose convenience. I chose to serve my country. America is not your country. It never will be. They proved that when they put us behind barbed wire." Kenji wanted to argue. wanted to explain everything he'd seen, everything he'd done, everything he'd sacrificed. But he realized his father would never understand, couldn't understand. They'd lived through the same war, but experienced it completely differently. Hiroshi's war was imprisonment, humiliation, loss. Kenji's war was combat, translation, impossible choices. They were speaking the same language but couldn't communicate. Kenji's mother stepped between them. "Enough," she said firmly. "The war is over. Our family is together. That's what matters." But it wasn't over. Not really. The war had ended, but its consequences would echo for decades, for the rest of their lives. Kenji tried to return to normal life. He used the GI Bill to finish his degree at Berkeley. He became a teacher, just as he'd planned before the war. He married a Nisei woman named Mary, had 2 children, bought a house in the suburbs. On the surface, he was living the American dream. The war was behind him. He'd moved on, but he hadn't. Not really. He had nightmares, not about combat. He'd never been in direct combat. But about the civilians. About Fumiko and her dead son. About the grandmother who'd killed her grandchildren. About the teenage girl at the cliff. About all the stories he'd translated. All the pain he'd witnessed. All the impossible choices he'd been forced to see. He'd wake up in the middle of the night, sweating, hearing Japanese voices begging for help, seeing small bodies in their mother's arms. Mary would hold him, ask him what was wrong, but he couldn't explain. How could he? She hadn't been there. She'd spent the war in a different camp, had her own traumas, but they were different traumas. She couldn't understand his specific ghosts. He never talked about the war. Not to his wife, not to his children, not to his students. When people asked about his service, he'd say he was an interpreter. Leave it at that. He didn't mention Okinawa, didn't mention the civilians, didn't mention Fumiko. But he thought about her constantly, wondered if she'd survived, wondered if she'd ever forgiven herself, wondered if her daughter grew up hating her mother for the choice she'd made, or understanding it, or something in between. He kept his own note in a way, not a physical note, but a memory. The image of those 2 words, written in a child's shaky handwriting, Yurushi Nasai, forgive me. Kenji realized that the note wasn't just for Fumiko. It was for him too, for all of them. Everyone who'd survived the war carried guilt. Guilt for surviving when others didn't. Guilt for the choices they'd made. Guilt for the things they'd done or failed to do. The question was, could they forgive themselves? Kenji didn't know. He tried. He built a good life. He was a good teacher, a good husband, a good father. He contributed to his community. He never spoke about his service, but he never denied it either. He existed in that liminal space, between Japanese and American, between pride and shame, between memory and forgetting. His father never forgave him. Hiroshi died in 1963, and his last words to Kenji were about the farm they'd lost, the life that had been taken from them. He never acknowledged what Kenji had done in the war. Never said he was proud. Never said he understood. Kenji grieved his father, but he also felt a strange relief. He'd spent 20 years trying to earn forgiveness for choices he'd made in impossible circumstances. And he'd finally realized that some people can't forgive, won't forgive, because forgiveness would mean acknowledging complexity, and complexity is harder than anger. For decades, the stories of Nisei soldiers like Kenji remained largely untold. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team became famous. They were the most decorated unit in U.S. military history for their size and length of service. But the Military Intelligence Service, the interpreters and translators, remained in the shadows. Their work was classified. Their contributions were secret. It wasn't until the 1980s and 90s that historians began documenting what the Nisei interpreters had done. They'd translated millions of pages of captured documents. They'd interrogated thousands of prisoners. They'd convinced countless civilians to surrender instead of committing suicide. Military historians estimated that Nisei linguists shortened the Pacific War by 2 years and saved hundreds of thousands of lives, both American and Japanese. But the Nisei themselves rarely talked about it. The trauma was too deep. The moral complexity was too great. How do you celebrate saving lives when you did it by helping destroy your ancestral homeland? In 1988, the U.S. government finally issued a formal apology for the internment of Japanese Americans. The Civil Liberties Act acknowledged that the internment was based on race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership rather than military necessity. Survivors received $20,000 in reparations. It was something, but it wasn't enough. Money couldn't give back the years lost, the property stolen, the dignity destroyed, and an apology 50 years later couldn't erase the fact that it had happened at all. Kenji was 68 years old when the apology came. He attended a ceremony in San Francisco where government officials expressed regret and handed out checks. He accepted his reparations, shook hands with politicians, listened to speeches about justice and healing. But he felt empty. The apology wasn't for him. Not really. It was for the government's conscience. It was so America could feel better about itself, could say, "We acknowledged our mistake. We made it right." But some things can't be made right. Some wounds don't heal. They just scar over, and you learn to live with the pain. Kenji never forgot his promise to Fumiko. He'd said he would remember her son, and he did. But he also wondered what happened to her, whether she'd survived, whether she'd found any peace. In 1995, 50 years after the war ended, Kenji attended a conference on the Battle of Okinawa at a university in California. Historians presented papers. Veterans shared testimonies. And there was a special session on civilian experiences, featuring Okinawan survivors who'd agreed to speak publicly for the first time. One of the speakers was an elderly woman named Akiko Nakamura. She was 60 years old, a professor of literature in Okinawa. She spoke about growing up in the aftermath of the battle, about losing her brother and watching her mother struggle with grief and guilt for decades. Kenji's heart stopped. Nakamura. Akiko. It couldn't be. After the presentation, he approached her. "Excuse me," he said in Japanese. "Your mother's name, was it Fumiko?" Akiko looked at him, surprised. "Yes. How did you know?" "I met her. In June of 1945. I was an interpreter. She was holding your brother's body. There was a note." Akiko's eyes filled with tears. "You're the soldier she talked about, the American with my brother's name." "Yes." They sat together in a quiet corner of the conference hall, and Akiko told him what had happened to Fumiko. She'd survived the war physically, but psychologically she never recovered. She lived in Okinawa, worked as a seamstress, raised Akiko as best she could, but she was distant, haunted. She kept the note with her always, carried it in a small pouch around her neck. She never remarried, never had more children. She'd wake up screaming in the night, reliving the cave collapse, the impossible choice. She'd apologize to Akiko constantly, saying she was sorry for saving her, sorry for letting Kenji die, sorry for being alive. Akiko grew up feeling guilty for surviving, guilty that her mother had chosen her, guilty that her existence was a constant reminder of her brother's death. It took years of therapy, decades of processing before she could separate her own identity from her mother's trauma. Fumiko died in 1963 at age 50. Heart attack, the doctors said. But Akiko believed it was grief. Her mother's heart had been broken for 18 years, and it finally just stopped. "She left a diary," Akiko said. "I found it after she died. She wrote in it almost every day. Most of it was about my brother, about the choice she made, about her guilt. But there was one entry about you, about me. She wrote that you were the only person who saw her as human that day. Everyone else saw her as a problem to be processed, a traumatized civilian to be moved through the system. But you sat with her. You listened. You witnessed her pain. She said that gave her permission to keep living even though she didn't think she deserved to." Kenji felt tears running down his face. He'd carried Fumiko's story for 50 years, wondering if he'd done enough, if he'd helped at all, if his presence had mattered. And now, 5 decades later, he had his answer. I made her a promise, Kenji said. I told her I'd remember her son. I have. I've thought about him almost every day for 50 years. Thank you, Akiko said. That means more than you know. They talked for hours. Akiko told him about her life, about becoming a professor, about studying literature as a way to understand trauma and memory. She'd written a book about civilian experiences in the Battle of Okinawa, including her mother's story. Kenji told her about his life, about his struggles with his father, about his nightmares, about the weight of translation, about carrying impossible stories in impossible circumstances. We're both survivors, Akiko said. We both carry the weight of choices other people made. Your choice to serve, my mother's choice in the cave. We didn't make those choices, but we live with their consequences. Do you forgive your mother? Kenji asked. I do now. It took a long time. I was angry for years. Angry that she chose me, angry that she couldn't move past her grief, angry that my childhood was defined by my brother's death. But eventually I realized she was doing the best she could with unbearable circumstances. She made an impossible choice in an impossible moment. She spent the rest of her life punishing herself for it. I don't need to punish her too. And do you forgive yourself for surviving? Akiko smiled sadly. I'm working on it. Some days are better than others. But I think that's all any of us can do. Keep working on it. Keep trying to forgive ourselves for being human.